This will be a quick video on the topic of answering Microsoft's top 10 interview questions. Question number 1. Can you share an example of a challenging project you've led, and how did you manage your team and resources to ensure its success? Right, so right from the start, you'd want to notice that this question can be addressed both to an individual contributor as well to a people management role. Right, example of a challenging project for a people manager role, it would basically ask for your ability to lead and to manage teams efficiently, right? Or another way you'd want to read this question on, can you share an example of a challenging project? What's the best story that you prepared for this interview? Because it's impossible that the best story you prepare for the interview doesn't contain any challenge, right? It must be your best story would also be one of your best wins, right? So this might as well qualify. It very much depends on how you regard this interview question, okay? Also, this is a behavioral interview question, which means it's best answered in the star format. Or at least if you're just getting started with these things, it's good to structure it this way, because this way you won't miss any key details or information that you would like to communicate, right? For manager or for people manager types of roles, behavioral interviewing skills are core, is subject matter expertise to what you do. So I would expect you to go even further than the STAR method, to dramatize a little bit and so on. Right, and I'll be going through more tips throughout this video with respect to these things. The second question I want to touch upon here would be, describe your experience with cloud technologies such as Azure or AWS, and how have you leveraged these in previous projects? All right, so needless to say, this question addresses to your technical expertise. Okay, so if your role involves or requires extensive knowledge of cloud technologies, then this question makes a ton of sense, and of course it's worth preparing. What type of experiences can you share to prove the fact that you are proficient, or you understand, you know what you're doing, you understand this business? Right, and even though the question is describe your experience with these cloud technologies, you could as well consider this again as a behavioral question. Tell me about the time when you had used these technologies successfully, right? The use case that you'd employ is hugely dependent on the type of role you are applying for, right? Someone in customer support, I'm not sure if that's needed to know, but someone in customer support would have a different example as compared to a senior manager, right, or even a director level role. But still, I believe this question is broad enough that it makes sense to a variety of roles, and therefore this is the core reason why I included in this example. Right. Question number 3. Can you talk about the time when you encountered a significant technical challenge, and how did you approach solving it with your team, ideally? Right. So a time when you encountered a significant challenge, right? A technical challenge. Now, if you're applying for customer support, or a customer challenge, a challenge with your customer, or a sales challenge. Again, the question is broad enough with minimal adjustments, so it makes sense to a variety of roles. Why would someone ask you this question in a job interview? They would ask you this in order to see your problem-solving skills. Okay, how did you solve that problem? And one of the favorite methods people shoot themselves in the foot answering these questions would be to talk about a failure, right? A project which wasn't really successful. So you say something on the lines of, hey, we encountered this huge technical challenge, we somehow solved it, but still it's maybe work in progress at best and stuff like that. So a job interview is about your successes, okay? And I find this that I have to remind candidates over and over again. And yes, these would be the main pointers. I would also like to stress out that an individual contributor role would talk about how they use their subject matter expertise to resolve this technical challenge, or sales or customer support challenge, while a people manager role would focus more on how they used their subject matter expertise as a people manager and eventually their team to maybe gather the required information to find the best course of action to resolve that technical challenge, right? Also, something that's worth mentioning here, people always have to be careful when you prepare your staff answer to be specific, with these things, to include stuff such as how long did that take to resolve. If it was something that took 1 hour to resolve, it might not be something as significant as if it took you 3 months, and a distributed team effort to resolve this. What was your specific role when this happened? And if this was a recent example, that it's a good idea to mention it. It was a recent one, because if the definition of behavioral interview is that they look at your past experiences so they can predict your future performance on the job, right? So whereas if an example happened 10 years ago, you won't necessarily want to say it right from the start. But if it's recent, then it's also to your advantage, right? You have problem-solving skills with a recent example of a challenge you solved, right? Number 4, how do you ensure effective collaboration between your team and other departments? Okay, effective collaboration between your team and other departments. Now, I have to agree that the way this question is framed, it's directly linked to a manager level role, to a people manager role, and how do you foster collaboration between your team and other departments? I don't know, maybe you set some workshops, maybe you did some other sort of meetings, maybe you had some software, or maybe you have some framework that you use to encourage these types of collaboration. So this question again would be linked to a people manager's subject matter expertise applying for a job in this context at Microsoft. All right, so effective collaboration, what is, you'll maybe want to think the other way around. What is inefficient collaboration between you and other teams? It is when, when the people are slow to reply, or no replies at all, when there is tension, when there is conflict between members of different teams. Okay, so focusing on having enough communication on resolving, or I should say even preventing those conflicts could be some pointers for you to talk about when answering this question of how do you ensure effective collaboration between your teams and others, right? Again, for a people manager role. Number 5, Microsoft emphasizes innovation. Can you discuss a time when you introduced a new technology or process that significantly improved a project's outcome? Okay, so I believe the reason why someone would ask you this question in a job interview is pretty clear. I mean, it's innovation. Are you an innovative person? And this question is again making sense for pretty much any role you'll choose, even if you're not involved in projects, but rather programs or other types of innovative thinking or innovation, if you want, right? So even if can you discuss time when you introduced a new technology or process, it comes when you came up with a new approach, an innovative approach to address a problem. Okay, so maybe for someone in customer support, they predicted a problem would happen, and they came up with an innovative way to address that challenge, that customer support challenge. Or for a developer, when you introduce a new technology, you could call that new technology a new algorithm that you came up with. Okay, maybe you modified, an algorithm to be quicker, to be faster, because that was the core that you were interested in. That was the innovation that you came up with to resolve something. It could be something incremental if you want. It doesn't have to be something like it's a patent pending thing. But still, you must sell yourself as someone innovative. Even using new technologies or new trends is something that you would like to talk about. Everyone talks about AI. Okay, so maybe talk about a use case when you used AI to have a more innovative way to achieve goals, right? Like, for example, I have in my on my website the ability for candidates to evaluate their stories using AI. Okay, this has proved to be quite successful. Or I have the ability on my website to demo the concept of a story bank to people who don't really understand what that means. Okay, so this is innovation. This is what I call innovation, and innovation again means different things to different types of roles. Next one, number 6. How do you manage and communicate with stakeholders who have conflicting priorities? Okay, so the way this question is framed is a bit counterintuitive. It's a bit complex because I wanted to touch upon the more senior types of roles, even people manager roles with these things. But for individual contributors or even for developers, you could simplify it as how do you communicate with stakeholders? Okay, tell me about the cross-functional collaboration. Right, it could be as simple as that, or a functional collaboration if you so wish. Right, but this would be still on the topic of interpersonal skills, and specifically for a manager level role or a people manager role, how it's called at Microsoft, that's stakeholder management. Okay, so how do you manage and communicate with stakeholders who have conflicting priorities? Well, one example is if you want to manage up, then you'd probably want to do it with more metrics in a more concise way. Maybe you use your interpersonal skills to see, hey, what works best to communicate with my executives, with the people whom I report to. Okay, if you go the other way around, communicate with stakeholders management who are direct reports or peers, maybe, I don't know, that it makes more sense to introduce some technology, to some digital stuff to encourage, to foster that communication and maybe to track that communication, and even, to track some progress and some goals you had set. I believe, again, it's a question of subject matter expertise for people manager roles, and it would be very much up to you to find out, hey, the types of frameworks maybe that you encouraged in your organization previously, and which ideally also gave some interesting results. All right, so it's still a behavioral type of question. How do you manage and communicate with stakeholders? You would want to talk about 1, 2, 3 examples of when your communication skills or your stakeholder management skills played a decisive role to a successful outcome. Right. Number 7. How do you foster a culture of inclusivity and diversity within your team? And can you provide an example? Okay, a culture of inclusivity and diversity within your team. I used to be a people manager in the past, and the way I would foster a culture of inclusivity and diversity in my team would be to link it with business outcomes. I'm a strong believer that if the business works, everyone would be happy ultimately, because they would be incentivized by success, both financially, but also success sells to achieve these things. And in my experience, diversity is a central element of success in many of these of today's teams. So this is how I would go around this, and linking this culture of inclusivity and diversity with business goals would be actually my policy as a people manager to achieve these goals. Number 8. How do you handle underperforming team members? And can you give an example of how you've turned around someone's performance or decided to make a change? Okay, so how do you handle underperforming team members? Again, a question specifically designed for people manager types of roles. What I would advise you against doing here would be to go with the traditional approach. Hey, I told them once and told them twice, and eventually either they got back on track, either you fire them. Real life examples are far different than this, and I'm sure that if you ask AI, they will give you some catchy stories, but still, if they're not yours, I believe they won't sound as great, right? So underperforming team members can, I once had an underperforming team member who was actually very smart, developer. But the problem with him, was since he knew he was smartest on the team, he wanted to lead that team. He wanted to transition from an individual contributor to a people manager type of role. And to resolve this, I actually did a trial. We allowed him to be in such a people manager role for a period of 2 months. And after 3 weeks, he realized that it's not really for him, because he was simply micromanaging everything. And he realized it wasn't the right time for him. And that's why, we handled these underperforming team members, right? So this is how I turn around someone's performance or decided to make a change, right? So actually by trialing this, by saying, hey, Neraj was his name. If you want to try, go ahead. Let's see what gives, right? And we ensured that he wouldn't actually release the whole thing. We wouldn't have a release because it was a controlled disaster, more or less. But long story short, come up with something that's interesting and that's yours, from your specific experience, right? Number 9, describe your experience with designing scalable and resilient software architectures. How do you ensure scalability in your projects? Okay, so the reason why someone would ask you this question, because they would want to see your expertise around scalability and architecture. Now, of course, this would be for a senior type of role. Still could well be for a people manager type of role, but someone who's a subject matter expert, senior TPM at least. Okay, so designing scalable and resilient software architectures. Some of you would say, hey, Dan, but this is a technical question, not necessarily a behavioral one, to which my answer would be, yes, you're right, but on this thinking, any behavioral question you could consider also a technical one. Because, for instance, if tell me about the conflict you had with a peer, and for a people manager, that's subject matter expertise, and therefore that's also a technical question too. So my point here is that even though the question is describe your experience with designing scalable and resilient software architectures, you could treat it as a behavioral one in a bid to start the conversation on the project on an initiative which proves your expertise in scalability and architecture, and eventually drive the conversation your way with one of the best achievements around scalability and architecture which you've had. And the deeper you'll dive, the more to your advantage this example will become. And by the way, these things have to be prepared in advance, because if that experience happened more than a number of years ago, you'll have a bit of a challenge remembering all the key details, right, of that story. Not hugely important for a screening round, but for final interview rounds, it's hugely important that you refresh these things. And I would even strongly encourage you to consider building a story bank for this matter. Even make a brain dump if you have such an example of several pages, simply because you realize that it becomes better and better if you revise it a number of times and if you think about all the details involved in it, right? So again, subject matter expertise to be tested here on scalability and architecture, but still a question that makes sense to prepare even for a behavioral interview, right? And the last question I want to talk about here, Microsoft places a strong emphasis on continuous learning. How do you encourage and support professional development within your team? Okay, so continuous learning. So how do you support professional development within your team? Again, a question more targeted for people manager types of roles, and specifically on talent development, right? So continuous learning. How do you build a culture of continuous learning? So maybe an interesting pointer I'd like to provide you here would be a bad sign of of someone's learning capability would be they only talk about learning from one source at most. I have that one guy on YouTube whom I follow for years, and this has been the main source of inspiration to grow in my expertise, right? So this is not a good sign. You'd want to focus on learning from multiple sources, and also ideally, maybe introduce a little bit of innovation or forward thinking. I'm sure you've run some innovation projects, some learning projects. Like I remember at some point a person whom I worked with mentioned how they budgeted from their personal money some training to quickly gather expertise for their team, some expertise they were lacking, which was critically important get them quickly on the go and to resolve a problem. So this is when compared to, asking for a budget for that and then so on and so forth. It was a significant amount of money, so it made sense for them to put their own money into the thing, to train their team, to help them to learn on the new challenge. It was technology, I believe. I cannot remember exactly what it was, but the point is they did something peculiar, right? And they did something memorable. If I remember it, even after I believe it was more than a year ago that I coached this guy. So I believe this is also an interesting way to close this. Your answers should be memorable, right? Usually speaking, if you prepare a story bank with your own stories and you provide the level of detail that you feel is best, it's also the best combination when your stories become memorable and they will remember you for hopefully the good reasons, and you also minimize the risk if you prepare it in advance for some monumental mistakes. Still you'll have to prepare for a few challenge and probing questions during your job interview, but I believe this would be a great starting point for a list of questions you'd want to consider in a Microsoft interview. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.